Tonight, we're traveling to 15th century England during one of the most turbulent periods in English history, the Wars of the Roses, to tell you the story of Elizabeth Woodville, known to history as the White Queen. This is a story about a secret love that changed the course of English history, about a commoner who became queen through beauty and determination, about a mother who faced unimaginable loss, and about a woman whose descendants would rule England for centuries. Elizabeth's story is remarkable because it combines romance, political intrigue, family tragedy, and historical mystery in ways that seem almost too dramatic to be real. She was a widow with two young sons who somehow captivated the most eligible bachelor in Europe, the King of England himself. She refused to become his mistress and insisted on marriage, which was almost unheard of for a commoner. She survived wars, betrayals, the loss of her children, and political upheavals that would have destroyed most people, and her legacy lives on in the British royal family today. What makes Elizabeth particularly fascinating is how she navigated the dangerous world of medieval politics without formal political training or noble birth. She wasn't born to power. She married into it through a love match that scandalized the kingdom. She used intelligence, courage, and maternal determination to protect her family through decades of conflict. She made alliances with former enemies, survived in sanctuary twice, and ultimately helped end one of England's bloodiest civil wars through her daughter's marriage. But Elizabeth's story also contains one of history's darkest mysteries, the disappearance of her two young sons, the princes in the Tower, which remains unsolved over 500 years later. This tragedy has haunted historians and captured imaginations for centuries, creating theories and speculation that continue today. We'll explore this mystery carefully, looking at what we know and acknowledging what remains unknown. The nickname White Queen comes from her family's association with the white rose, symbol of the House of York during the Wars of the Roses. But it also captures something about Elizabeth herself, her legendary beauty, her dignity under pressure, her ability to survive in a world that was often hostile to her. She was a queen who faced extraordinary challenges and somehow endured when many others fell. Before we get to the dramatic events of her queenship, we need to understand where Elizabeth came from and how she ended up in the desperate situation that led to her famous encounter with the king. Elizabeth Woodville was born around 1437, the eldest daughter of Richard Woodville and Jacquetta of Luxembourg. Her father was a knight, respectable but not high nobility. Her mother was more distinguished, coming from European nobility and having been married previously to an English duke. This background is important because it shaped how Elizabeth was viewed throughout her life. She wasn't a peasant or truly common, but she also wasn't from the ancient noble families that dominated English politics. She was what we might call gentry or minor nobility. Respectable but not powerful, educated but not wealthy, connected but not influential. This in-between status would cause enormous problems when she became queen. Elizabeth's first marriage was to Sir John Grey, a knight who fought for the Lancastrian side during the Wars of the Roses. To understand the significance of this, we need to briefly explain the conflict tearing England apart. The Wars of the Roses was a civil war between two branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster, symbolized by a red rose, and the House of York, symbolized by a white rose. Both sides had claims to the throne, and the conflict involved battles, betrayals, and constantly shifting allegiances. John Grey fought for Lancaster, and Elizabeth supported her husband's cause. They had two sons together, Thomas and Richard Grey. But in 1461, John Grey was killed in battle fighting for the Lancastrian cause. This left Elizabeth a widow at about age 24, with two young sons to support. Her situation became even more desperate because the Yorkists won that particular phase of the war, and the victorious King Edward IV confiscated lands from Lancastrian supporters. Elizabeth's lands and properties were seized because her late husband had fought against the new king. She suddenly found herself in financial difficulty, struggling to provide for her sons and to secure their inheritance. She was a young, beautiful widow with dependent children, living in a kingdom where her late husband's side had lost the war. She needed help from the very king whose forces had killed her husband. This desperate situation led to the encounter that would change her life. The most famous story about how Elizabeth met King Edward IV involves an oak tree in Whittleberry Forest. According to legend, Elizabeth positioned herself under the oak tree, knowing the king would pass by while hunting. When Edward and his party appeared, Elizabeth stepped forward with her two young sons, threw herself on her knees, and begged the king to restore her son's inheritance. This direct appeal to royal mercy was a bold move for a widow of an enemy. Whether the story is literally true or somewhat romanticized, what's certain is that Elizabeth and Edward IV met sometime in 1464, and the king was immediately captivated by her. Edward IV was famous throughout Europe for his good looks, charm, and appeal to women. He was tall, handsome, charismatic, and had a reputation for numerous romantic conquests. He was accustomed to women wanting his favor and attention. Elizabeth was different. Contemporary descriptions emphasize Elizabeth's extraordinary beauty. She was said to have blonde hair, graceful bearing, and lovely features. But she also had dignity and self-possession that distinguished her from the women who usually surrounded the king. She was a mature widow and mother, not a giggling courtier. She'd experienced loss and hardship that gave her gravity. Edward was intrigued not just by her looks, but by her character. According to various historical accounts, Edward initially approached Elizabeth as he did other attractive women, suggesting she might become his mistress. This was common practice for medieval kings, who often had official mistresses alongside their political marriages to queens. Edward probably expected Elizabeth to be honored by royal attention and to accept the arrangement. After all, becoming the king's favorite could bring wealth, position, and security for her and her sons. But Elizabeth refused the king's advances with remarkable boldness. The most famous version of this refusal involves Elizabeth allegedly drawing a dagger and threatening to kill herself rather than lose her honor. Whether this dramatic gesture actually occurred or is legendary embellishment, what's clear is that Elizabeth firmly rejected becoming Edward's mistress. She apparently told him something along the lines of, "I'm not good enough to be your wife, but I'm too good to be your mistress." This response was calculated brilliance. Elizabeth understood that giving in to Edward would bring short-term benefits but long-term shame. As the king's mistress, she'd be dependent on his continued favor, vulnerable to replacement by newer favorites, and unable to make a respectable second marriage. Her sons would be associated with their mother's dishonor. But by refusing, she challenged Edward's ego and made herself more desirable through unavailability. Edward was apparently unused to rejection. Most women were eager for royal favor. Elizabeth's refusal intrigued him and made him more determined. He pursued her, and she continued to refuse unless he offered marriage. This was an audacious demand. Kings didn't marry commoners, especially not widows of enemy soldiers. Royal marriages were diplomatic arrangements with foreign princesses or high nobility. Marriage to Elizabeth would bring no political advantages and would scandalize the nobility. But Edward IV was young, impulsive, and genuinely infatuated. He was about 22 years old, ruling his first kingdom, and accustomed to getting what he wanted. Elizabeth was about 27, experienced enough to know her worth, and desperate enough to take risks. The combination of Edward's impetuousness and Elizabeth's determination led to a decision that would shock the kingdom. In May 1464, Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville were secretly married in a private ceremony. The wedding took place at her family home in Grafton, with only Elizabeth's mother, a priest, and 2 other witnesses present. There was no public announcement, no celebration, no involvement of the nobility or church officials. The King of England had married a commoner widow in secret, which was almost unprecedented in English royal history. Why did Edward keep the marriage secret initially? Probably because he knew how controversial it would be. His advisors would oppose it. The nobility would be scandalized. His most powerful supporter, the Earl of Warwick, was in the middle of negotiating a diplomatic marriage for Edward with a French princess. Edward must have known that revealing the marriage would create enormous problems, but he apparently couldn't resist Elizabeth and hoped to manage the fallout later. For several months, Edward and Elizabeth maintained the secret. Edward would visit Elizabeth discreetly, and they lived as married couple in private, while Edward continued to function as unmarried king in public. This deception couldn't last forever, though, and the revelation, when it came, caused exactly the scandal Edward had probably feared. The Earl of Warwick, known to history as Warwick the Kingmaker because of his crucial role in putting Edward on the throne, was Edward's most powerful advisor and supporter. Warwick was negotiating Edward's marriage to a French princess as part of a diplomatic alliance with France. This was standard practice for medieval kings. Marriage was a tool of foreign policy, used to create alliances and prevent wars. Warwick had been conducting these delicate negotiations in good faith, making promises to the French court. In September 1464, about 4 months after the secret wedding, the truth came out. The royal council was pressing Edward to agree to the French marriage Warwick had been negotiating. Edward could no longer avoid the issue. In a council meeting, when Warwick and other advisors were discussing the French marriage and urging Edward to agree, Edward shocked everyone by announcing that he couldn't marry the French princess because he was already married to Elizabeth Woodville. The reaction was explosive. Warwick felt personally betrayed and publicly humiliated. He'd been negotiating in France on behalf of a king who was secretly already married, making Warwick look foolish or deceitful to the French court. The other nobles were scandalized that Edward had married so far beneath his station. Elizabeth was a commoner, a widow, and, worst of all from the Yorkist perspective, the widow of a Lancastrian soldier. She brought no diplomatic advantages, no wealth, no powerful foreign alliances. But Edward had made his choice, and medieval law recognized the marriage as valid, even though it had been secret. Elizabeth was legally Queen of England, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Edward had exercised his royal prerogative to marry whom he chose, and the nobility had to accept it whether they liked it or not. Elizabeth was publicly acknowledged as Queen and crowned in a ceremony at Westminster Abbey in 1465. The marriage transformed Elizabeth's life completely. She went from struggling widow to Queen of England, one of the most powerful positions in Europe. Her sons from her first marriage were now the king's stepsons, with royal protection and opportunities. But her elevation also created enormous problems. The English nobility resented this commoner who'd somehow become their queen. They saw her as an upstart who didn't deserve her position. Elizabeth's large family made the resentment worse. She had numerous siblings, brothers and sisters who were now the queen's relatives. Edward IV used royal patronage to advance Elizabeth's family, giving them titles, lands, and arranging advantageous marriages for them to noble families. This was normal practice. Kings typically rewarded and elevated their in-laws. But because Elizabeth's family had been relatively minor nobility, their rapid elevation was particularly big, obvious, and resented. The old nobility, families who'd been powerful for generations, had to watch as the Woodville family suddenly rose to prominence. Elizabeth's siblings were married into ancient noble families, given important positions at court and in government, and enriched with royal grants. This created a new faction at court, the Woodville faction, that competed with established noble families for influence and patronage. Warwick particularly resented the Woodville family's rise because it represented his declining influence over Edward. Before Edward's marriage, Warwick had been the dominant figure at court, the king's chief advisor whose opinion shaped policy. Now, Edward had a wife who naturally had his ear, and the Queen's numerous relatives formed a faction that competed with Warwick's influence. Warwick felt he was being pushed aside by upstart Woodvilles. The tension between Warwick and the Woodvilles grew over several years. Warwick wanted Edward to pursue alliance with France, which had been Warwick's consistent foreign policy goal. The Woodvilles favored alliance with Burgundy instead. Edward sided more with his wife's family than with Warwick, which further alienated his former chief supporter. The man who'd helped put Edward on the throne was now feeling marginalized and resentful. In 1469, Warwick's resentment turned to open rebellion. He allied with Edward's younger brother George, Duke of Clarence, who was also angry at being pushed aside by the Woodvilles. Warwick and Clarence raised an army and moved against Edward. They captured Elizabeth's father, Earl Rivers, and her brother John Woodville, and had them executed for treason. This was devastating for Elizabeth personally. Her father and brother were killed by her husband's former ally in a power struggle. The situation became even more dangerous when Warwick and Clarence captured Edward IV himself. The king was briefly imprisoned by his own former supporter and his own brother. This put Elizabeth in a terrifying position. Her husband was captive, her family members had been killed, and she was alone at court with enemies surrounding her. She was pregnant with her third child by Edward, which made her situation even more vulnerable. But Warwick soon discovered that imprisoning the king wasn't politically viable. Too many nobles supported Edward's legitimacy as king, even if they didn't all like the Woodville influence. Warwick was forced to release Edward, who regained control and temporarily reconciled with Warwick and Clarence. But the reconciliation was fragile, based on necessity rather than trust. Everyone knew the underlying conflicts remained unresolved. The fragile peace broke down in 1470 when Warwick and Clarence rebelled again, this time more seriously. They allied with the Lancastrians, Warwick's former enemies, in an attempt to overthrow Edward IV and restore the previous Lancastrian king, Henry VI, to the throne. This was a stunning reversal. Warwick had originally fought to put Edward on the throne. Now he was fighting to remove him. Politics made for strange alliances. Edward IV was forced to flee England, escaping to Burgundy in exile. This left Elizabeth alone, heavily pregnant with their fourth child, in a hostile England where Warwick and the Lancastrians were now in control. She faced immediate danger. As the Yorkist queen, she was an obvious target for the new Lancastrian government. She needed to find safety quickly, and there was only one place in medieval England where she could be truly safe from arrest. Elizabeth fled to Westminster Abbey and claimed sanctuary. Sanctuary was a medieval church practice where anyone who took refuge in a holy place couldn't be forcibly removed. To violate sanctuary was sacrilege that would bring divine punishment. Churches, and particularly major sanctuaries like Westminster Abbey, provided protection even from royal authority. Criminals, debtors, and political refugees all used sanctuary to escape arrest. But sanctuary wasn't comfortable. Elizabeth was confined to a small area of the abbey with her 3 daughters from Edward and her 2 sons from her first marriage. They had limited food, no luxuries, and couldn't leave without risking arrest. She was cut off from news, dependent on sympathetic clergy and servants who smuggled information and supplies to her. And she was heavily pregnant, about to give birth in these difficult circumstances. In November 1470, while living in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth gave birth to her first son with Edward IV. She named him Edward after his father, who was in exile and didn't even know his heir had been born. This baby boy, born in sanctuary to a fugitive queen, was technically the heir to the throne if the Yorkist side could ever regain power. But at the moment of his birth, that seemed unlikely. The conditions in sanctuary were harsh. Medieval accounts describe Elizabeth having to live simply, with limited attendance and basic food. She was a queen living like a refugee, uncertain whether her husband would ever return or whether she and her children would remain indefinitely in this church prison. For a woman who'd been living in royal luxury just months before, the contrast must have been shocking. But sanctuary kept her and her children alive. Elizabeth spent about 5 months in sanctuary, from October 1470 to March 1471. During this time, Edward IV was gathering support in Burgundy and planning his return to England. He landed in March 1471 with military forces and began fighting to reclaim his throne. The campaign moved quickly. Within weeks, Edward had won crucial battles, recaptured London, and overthrown Warwick's attempt to restore Lancastrian rule. At the Battle of Barnet in April 1471, Edward's forces defeated and killed Warwick, the kingmaker. The man who'd helped make Edward king, then tried to unmake him, died on the battlefield. This removed Edward's most dangerous enemy and his former closest ally. Edward followed this victory with another triumph at the Battle of Tewkesbury, which essentially ended the Lancastrian challenge to his throne. Edward IV had successfully fought his way back to power. Elizabeth and her children emerged from sanctuary in triumph rather than tragedy. Edward returned to Westminster Abbey not as a fugitive, but as the victorious king, and he met his infant son for the first time. The family was reunited, and Elizabeth was restored to her position as queen. The months of fear and deprivation in sanctuary were over. She could return to court life, though the experience must have left psychological scars. The years following Edward's restoration were relatively peaceful and prosperous for Elizabeth and her family. Between 1470 and 1483, Elizabeth gave birth to 7 more children with Edward, 5 daughters and 2 more sons. Their household was large and apparently happy. Edward was a successful king during this period, bringing stability to England after years of civil war. Elizabeth performed her duties as queen, patronizing the church, participating in court ceremonies, and raising their large family. Elizabeth used her position to continue advancing her family. Her siblings held important positions. Her sons from her first marriage were given titles and estates, and her daughters with Edward were valuable as potential marriage partners to forge alliances. The Woodville family had become firmly established among England's most powerful families. Elizabeth had successfully leveraged her marriage to the king to lift her entire family into the upper nobility. But Elizabeth never forgot the vulnerability she'd experienced during the rebellions and her time in sanctuary. She understood that political fortunes could reverse quickly, that today's security could become tomorrow's danger. This awareness probably shaped how she thought about protecting her children and ensuring their futures. She couldn't know how soon those fears would be realized again, in circumstances even worse than before. In April 1483, disaster struck with shocking suddenness. King Edward IV, who was only about 40 years old and apparently healthy, suddenly fell ill. Within days, he was dead. The exact cause isn't clear from historical sources, possibly pneumonia, stroke, or some other acute illness. Medieval medicine couldn't save him, and England suddenly had a child king and a widowed queen facing an uncertain political situation. Edward IV's death left his 12-year-old son, also named Edward, as king. The boy was at Ludlow Castle in the Welsh Marches, where he'd been living as Prince of Wales, learning to govern. Elizabeth was in London with her other children. The young prince would need to travel to London for his coronation, and until he came of age, someone would need to govern as regent. This situation was politically dangerous because it invited power struggles over who would control the young king. Edward IV had apparently named his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as protector during young Edward V's minority. This was a logical choice. Richard was the dead king's brother, an experienced military commander, and had been loyal to Edward IV throughout the rebellions. But Elizabeth and her family were nervous about Richard having so much power. They'd clashed with him previously over influence at court, and they worried he might sideline them during the regency. Elizabeth and her Woodville relatives attempted to maintain control by having young Edward V escorted to London by her brother, Earl Rivers, with a large force of armed men. The plan was to crown the young king quickly and establish a regency council where the Woodvilles would have strong influence. But Richard, Duke of Gloucester, moved faster. He intercepted the young king's party en route to London, arrested Earl Rivers and other Woodville supporters, and took personal custody of Edward V. This was a devastating blow to Elizabeth's power and security. Her brother was arrested, her son was in Richard's custody, and she'd lost control of the situation. Richard brought young Edward V to London and installed him in the Tower of London, which was both a royal palace and a fortress. This wasn't immediately ominous. The Tower was a traditional residence for monarchs, and young Edward was there as king-in-waiting, preparing for coronation. But Elizabeth had reason to be worried about Richard's intentions. Elizabeth made a decision that showed both her fear and her memory of previous dangers. She fled into sanctuary again. This time she brought her 5 daughters and her younger son, 9-year-old Richard, Duke of York. They took refuge in Westminster Abbey, the same place Elizabeth had sheltered 13 years earlier when Edward IV was in exile. For the second time in her life, Elizabeth was hiding from political enemies, uncertain what would happen to her and her children. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, now controlled London as protector, with the young King Edward V in his custody at the Tower. But Elizabeth and her younger children were safe in sanctuary, where Richard couldn't legally reach them. This standoff created tension. Richard wanted to control the entire royal family, while Elizabeth was determined to keep at least some of her children beyond his reach. Neither side was sure what would happen next. Then Richard made accusations that stunned the kingdom. He claimed that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth had been invalid, which would mean all their children were illegitimate and couldn't inherit the throne. The grounds for this claim were technical. Richard alleged that Edward had been pre-contracted to marry someone else before he married Elizabeth, which, under medieval law, would make the later marriage invalid even if the pre-contract hadn't been formalized. The evidence for this pre-contract was dubious at best. The woman Edward had allegedly been pre-contracted to was long dead and couldn't confirm or deny the claim. The whole accusation seemed like a legal excuse to remove Edward IV's children from the succession. But Richard had the power to push the claim through, and a parliament eventually declared Edward and Elizabeth's children illegitimate. This was devastating. Elizabeth's children were suddenly bastards with no rights. With Edward V declared illegitimate, Richard claimed the throne for himself as the legitimate heir. He was crowned Richard III in July 1483, just 3 months after his brother Edward IV had died. Young Edward V, who'd been king-in-waiting, was now simply Edward of York, an illegitimate boy with no claim to anything. Richard had successfully taken the throne from his nephew through legal maneuvering backed by military power. Elizabeth was still in sanctuary with her daughters and younger son when Richard was crowned. She faced an agonizing situation. Her eldest son, Edward, was in the Tower, in Richard's custody, now declared illegitimate and deposed from the throne he'd been about to inherit. She had her younger son, Richard, Duke of York, safe with her in sanctuary. Richard III wanted the boy. He claimed it was inappropriate to keep the young prince in sanctuary, that the boy should be with his brother. Richard sent messages to Elizabeth demanding she release young Richard of York from sanctuary. He promised the boy wouldn't be harmed, that he would simply join his brother in the Tower where they'd be raised together appropriately. Richard argued that there was no reason to keep the boy in sanctuary, since no one wished him harm. The pressure on Elizabeth was intense. Refusal would anger the new king and keep her son confined to sanctuary indefinitely. Elizabeth faced an impossible choice: keep her son in sanctuary where he was safe but confined, or trust Richard's promises and send the boy to his brother in the Tower. She had no good options. If she refused, Richard might use force. Sanctuary could be violated if the king was determined enough, even at cost of sacrilege. If she agreed, she'd be surrendering her son to a man who'd already seized power from her eldest son through questionable legal claims. Eventually, Elizabeth made the heartbreaking decision to surrender her younger son. Perhaps she believed Richard's promises. Perhaps she felt she had no choice. Perhaps she thought the boys would be safer together. In June 1483, young Richard, Duke of York, left sanctuary and joined his brother in the Tower of London. Elizabeth had now lost both her sons to Richard III's custody. This decision would haunt history, and probably haunted Elizabeth for the rest of her life. The two boys, Edward, aged 12, and Richard, aged 9, were now together in the Tower of London. They were seen occasionally through windows, playing in the Tower gardens, but gradually the sightings became less frequent. The boys were seen less and less often. Then they weren't seen at all. By the fall of 1483, reports suggested the princes were no longer in the Tower, or at least weren't being seen publicly anymore. They had disappeared. What happened to the princes in the Tower remains one of history's greatest mysteries. They vanished without any official explanation. Richard III never produced them or explained their whereabouts. Various theories have been proposed over the centuries. Some believe they were killed on Richard III's orders to eliminate potential threats to his throne. Others suggest they might have died of illness. Still others propose more elaborate scenarios involving escape or hidden identities. In 1674, workmen at the Tower discovered a wooden box containing the bones of 2 children buried beneath a staircase. These remains were assumed to be the princes and were reburied in Westminster Abbey, but they've never been scientifically examined in modern times to confirm identity or cause of death. The mystery remains unsolved, and historians continue to debate what actually happened to Edward IV's sons in the summer and fall of 1483. For Elizabeth, the disappearance of her sons was devastating tragedy. She'd already lost her father and brother to Warwick's rebellion. Now her 2 sons by Edward IV had vanished while in Richard III's custody. She couldn't openly accuse Richard of anything without endangering her daughters, who were still with her in sanctuary. She couldn't rescue or even locate her missing sons. She was trapped, grieving, and powerless to help her children. Elizabeth remained in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey for months after her sons disappeared. She was effectively a prisoner there, unable to leave without submitting to Richard III's authority. Her daughters were with her, but they were growing up confined to the Abbey rather than living as princesses at court. Elizabeth needed to find a way to protect her remaining children and perhaps to seek justice or revenge against Richard III. During this desperate period, Elizabeth made contact with someone who seemed an unlikely ally: Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry Tudor. Margaret and Elizabeth had been on opposite sides of the Wars of the Roses, Margaret was from the Lancastrian side. Elizabeth had been Yorkist queen. But they had a common enemy in Richard III, and common interest in removing him from power. Sometimes, former enemies can become allies when circumstances change. Margaret Beaufort's son, Henry Tudor, was in exile in France, with a distant but legitimate claim to the English throne through the Lancastrian line. He'd been in exile for years, waiting for an opportunity to return to England and claim the throne. Richard III's usurpation and the mysterious disappearance of Edward IV's sons created that opportunity. Many people were unhappy with Richard and might support an alternative. Elizabeth and Margaret secretly negotiated an agreement that was politically brilliant and personally strategic for both women. Henry Tudor would invade England to overthrow Richard III. If successful, Henry would marry Elizabeth's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. This marriage would unite the houses of Lancaster and York, ending the dynastic conflict that had torn England apart for decades. It would also restore Elizabeth Woodville's family to royal status through her daughter. The agreement gave both women what they wanted. Margaret would see her son become king. Elizabeth would see her daughter become queen, and would secure futures for her surviving children. Most importantly, they'd both see Richard III removed from power. Margaret because she wanted her son to rule, Elizabeth because she held Richard responsible for the loss of her sons and her family's downfall. Their alliance was based on shared interests rather than friendship, but it was effective. The planning for Henry Tudor's invasion took over a year. Henry needed to gather forces, ships, and supplies in France. Margaret Beaufort worked secretly in England to build support for Henry's claim, communicating with nobles who might be persuaded to turn against Richard III. Elizabeth, from her sanctuary refuge, did what she could to encourage support for the planned invasion and the proposed marriage alliance. Throughout this period, Elizabeth faced another form of attack that shows how she was perceived and how her enemies tried to undermine her. Various accusations circulated that Elizabeth was a witch, that she'd used magic or sorcery to bewitch Edward IV into marrying her, that she came from a line of enchantresses. These accusations tapped into medieval fears about powerful women and tried to explain Elizabeth's rise from commoner to queen as supernatural rather than natural. The specific accusation was that Elizabeth's mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, was descended from Melusina, a legendary water spirit or fairy from European folklore. Melusina was said to be a beautiful woman who married a nobleman, but was actually supernatural, and her descendants were supposed to carry her magical blood. These stories about Elizabeth having fairy or witch ancestry were clearly propaganda, attempts to delegitimize her and her children by suggesting she'd achieved her position through evil magic rather than legitimate marriage. The witch accusations against Elizabeth were particularly gendered attacks. When women achieved power or influence in medieval society, they were often accused of witchcraft or sorcery as an explanation. Men couldn't believe women could be powerful through intelligence or capability alone, so they attributed female success to supernatural evil. Elizabeth's beauty, her successful refusal to become Edward's mistress, and her influence over the king were all reinterpreted as evidence of magical seduction rather than natural charm and intelligence. But these accusations, while damaging to Elizabeth's reputation, didn't change the political situation. Richard III controlled England, Elizabeth was in sanctuary with her daughters, her sons had disappeared, and Henry Tudor was preparing to invade. The invasion finally came in August 1485, when Henry landed in Wales with French support and English exiles who joined him abroad. He marched into England, gathering supporters as he went. Richard III moved to confront Henry's invasion with his royal army. The two forces met at Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, in one of the most consequential battles in English history. The battle's outcome would determine who ruled England and would shape the course of English history for centuries. Elizabeth, still in sanctuary, must have been waiting anxiously for news, knowing her family's future depended on the outcome. The Battle of Bosworth Field was won by Henry Tudor. Richard III died fighting on the battlefield, killed by Henry's forces. The crown that Richard had worn into battle was reportedly picked up from the battlefield and placed on Henry's head, symbolically transferring kingship in that moment. Henry Tudor became King Henry VII, ending the Yorkist dynasty and beginning the Tudor dynasty that would rule England for over a century. Richard III's death at Bosworth meant different things to different people. For Henry Tudor and Margaret Beaufort, it was triumph. Henry had successfully invaded and conquered a kingdom. For many English nobles, it was relief. They'd supported, or at least accepted, Henry as a way to end the chaos of Richard's controversial reign. For Elizabeth Woodville, it was complicated. Satisfaction at seeing Richard III defeated, but also grief, because her missing sons were now almost certainly dead and wouldn't benefit from Henry's victory. Following his victory, Henry VII moved to consolidate his position as king. Part of this consolidation involved honoring the agreement he'd made with Elizabeth Woodville. In January 1486, just 5 months after Bosworth, Henry VII married Elizabeth of York, Elizabeth Woodville's eldest daughter. This marriage united the houses of Lancaster and York, symbolically ending the Wars of the Roses by joining the rival dynasties. The marriage was politically important, but also personally significant for Elizabeth Woodville. Her daughter was now Queen of England, which restored the family's royal status. Elizabeth of York would have children who would be both Tudor and York, both Lancaster and Woodville. Through her daughter and future grandchildren, Elizabeth Woodville's bloodline would continue in England's royal family. This was some compensation for the terrible losses she'd suffered. The marriage also officially ended the Wars of the Roses. The conflict had been based on competing claims between Lancaster and York. Now those claims were united in the marriage of Henry VII, Lancaster, and Elizabeth of York, York. Their children would inherit claims from both sides, eliminating the dynastic dispute that had caused decades of civil war. The union of the roses, red and white combined into the Tudor rose, symbolized this reconciliation. Elizabeth Woodville's role in all this was crucial, but somewhat hidden. She'd negotiated the marriage alliance from sanctuary, had supported Henry Tudor's invasion, and had agreed to see her daughter marry a Lancastrian to end the wars. But now that Henry VII was king and Elizabeth of York was queen, Elizabeth Woodville's own position was ambiguous. She was the king's mother-in-law, but also the widow of a Yorkist king and mother of the missing princes. How would she fit into the new Tudor regime? Initially, Elizabeth Woodville seemed to maintain reasonable status. She was treated with respect as the king's mother-in-law and as the dowager queen. She had property and income. She saw her daughter installed as queen and eventually saw the birth of her first grandchild by Henry VII, a son named Arthur, who represented the Tudor dynasty's future. For a few years, Elizabeth's situation seemed stable, even if she'd never recover the power she'd had as Edward IV's queen. But in 1487, Elizabeth Woodville's position changed dramatically and mysteriously. She was suddenly stripped of her properties and income and sent to live at Bermondsey Abbey. This wasn't exactly imprisonment, but it was effective retirement from public life. She would spend the rest of her life at the Abbey, living quietly and seeing very few people. The reasons for this dramatic change in her status remain debated by historians. Some historians suggest Henry VII removed Elizabeth Woodville from court because she'd supported a rebellion or plot against him. In 1487, there was a Yorkist uprising supporting a pretender claiming to be one of the princes in the Tower. If Elizabeth had shown sympathy for this claim or had been in contact with the rebels, Henry might have decided she was a political danger. Removing her to Bermondsey would neutralize any threat without the scandal of imprisoning or executing his mother-in-law. Other historians propose that Elizabeth's retirement was more voluntary or was arranged by mutual agreement. After decades of political turmoil, after losing her husband, sons, father, brother, and suffering through wars and sanctuary, Elizabeth might have been exhausted and willing to withdraw from public life. The abbey could be seen as a peaceful refuge where she could spend her remaining years in religious devotion rather than political intrigue. Perhaps she chose retirement. A third possibility is that the retirement was negotiated as part of complex Tudor political maneuvering. Henry VII was establishing a new dynasty and didn't want competing sources of royal authority or nostalgia for the Yorkist past. Elizabeth Woodville, as Edward IV's widow and mother of the missing princes, represented that past. Sending her to Bermondsey removed her from politics while treating her respectfully enough to avoid scandal. It was a compromise that served multiple purposes. Whatever the true reason, and we may never know with certainty, Elizabeth spent her final years at Bermondsey Abbey in relative obscurity. She was allowed visits from family occasionally and maintained some contact with her daughter, the Queen. But her days of political involvement were over. For a woman who'd been at the center of power struggles for over 20 years, this quiet ending must have been strange, perhaps peaceful, possibly lonely. Elizabeth died at Bermondsey Abbey on June 8, 1492, at about age 55. She'd survived Edward IV by 9 years, had seen Richard III defeated, had witnessed her daughter become queen and give birth to the next generation of royalty. She'd experienced extraordinary highs and devastating lows, from commoner widow to Queen of England, from royal luxury to sanctuary refugee, from political power to monastic retirement. Elizabeth's funeral was modest compared to what might be expected for a former queen. She was buried at Windsor Castle next to Edward IV, which was appropriate as his widow. But the ceremony wasn't as elaborate as many royal funerals. This might reflect her reduced status at the time of death, or it might have been her own wishes for a simple burial. She was reunited in death with the husband she'd loved enough to refuse becoming his mistress, insisting instead on marriage. The mystery of what happens to Elizabeth's sons, the princes in the Tower, has never been definitively solved. Richard III never explained their disappearance. Henry VII, who might have used their presumed deaths to further discredit Richard, also never provided clear information. Various pretenders claiming to be one of the princes emerged over the years, suggesting some people believe they might have survived. But none of these claims were ever proven legitimate. For Elizabeth personally, the disappearance of her sons must have been the defining tragedy of her life. All the political success, the queenship, even her daughter becoming queen, couldn't compensate for the loss of her children. We don't know what Elizabeth believed had happened to them, whether she knew they were dead, hoped they might have somehow survived, or simply lived with unbearable uncertainty. Historical sources don't give us access to her private grief. Elizabeth's legacy lived on through her daughter, Elizabeth of York, who was, by all accounts, a successful and beloved queen. Elizabeth of York and Henry VII had multiple children, including Henry VIII, who would become one of England's most famous kings. Through Henry VIII and his children, Elizabeth Woodville's bloodline continued in the English monarchy. Every English monarch since Henry VII has been descended from Elizabeth Woodville. This genealogical legacy is remarkable for a woman who started as a commoner widow. Elizabeth's beauty and determination led to a secret marriage that scandalized the kingdom. From that controversial beginning, she became queen, survived wars and political upheavals, lost children to violence and mystery, and ultimately became the grandmother and ancestress of a new royal dynasty. Her blood flows through the veins of British royalty to this day. Elizabeth of York is often depicted in portraits with pale blonde hair and fair skin, presumably inheriting her mother's legendary beauty. Elizabeth Woodville's looks, which had initially captivated Edward IV, were passed to her daughter and, through her, to future generations. The physical beauty that had been Elizabeth Woodville's initial advantage, the feature that caught a king's eye, became part of the Tudor family's appearance and legacy. The secret marriage between Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville remained one of the most romantic and controversial royal marriages in English history. It broke all the rules about kings marrying for dynastic advantage rather than personal preference. It caused political problems throughout Edward's reign and contributed to the succession crisis after his death. Yet it also produced children who ultimately helped end the Wars of the Roses and establish a new dynasty. The story of Elizabeth Woodville has inspired numerous works of fiction, historical novels, and dramatic adaptations. The nickname, the White Queen, has been used for books and television series exploring her life. Popular interest in Elizabeth reflects the dramatic nature of her story, the romantic beginning with the secret marriage, the political intrigue of court life, the tragedy of the missing princes, and the ultimate triumph of her daughter becoming queen of a new dynasty. But separating the real Elizabeth from the fictionalized versions requires careful attention to historical evidence. Some aspects of her story are well documented: the secret marriage, the sanctuary episodes, the political conflicts. Other aspects are more speculative: her personality, her private feelings, her role in various plots and schemes. We have to be careful not to assume that fictional portrayals, no matter how compelling, reflect historical reality. What we can say with confidence is that Elizabeth Woodville was a remarkable survivor in a dangerous era. She lived through decades of civil war, survived 2 periods in sanctuary, witnessed the deaths of family members in political violence, lost her sons to one of history's darkest mysteries, and somehow continued living and adapting to circumstances. This resilience, this ability to survive when many others didn't, is perhaps her most impressive characteristic. Elizabeth's initial refusal to become Edward IV's mistress, her insistence on marriage, showed intelligence and self-knowledge. She understood that short-term gains as a royal mistress wouldn't provide long-term security for herself or her sons from her first marriage. By holding out for marriage, she risked losing royal favor entirely, but she also positioned herself for much greater security and status. This calculation required courage and confidence in her own worth. The decision to go into sanctuary twice showed both Elizabeth's understanding of medieval legal protections and her willingness to endure hardship to protect her children. Sanctuary wasn't comfortable or dignified, but it provided safety when she had no other options. Many medieval women in desperate situations used sanctuary, but few queens did. Elizabeth's willingness to live in sanctuary shows she prioritized survival over dignity or comfort. Elizabeth's alliance with Margaret Beaufort to support Henry Tudor and arrange the marriage between Henry and Elizabeth of York showed political sophistication. These were former enemies finding common ground against Richard III. The marriage they arranged ended the Wars of the Roses and established a new dynasty. This political maneuvering from sanctuary, while her sons were missing, shows Elizabeth continuing to think strategically, even in desperate circumstances. The witch accusations against Elizabeth reveal the gendered nature of medieval political attacks. Powerful women were often accused of sorcery or unnatural influence as a way to explain and delegitimize their power. Elizabeth's beauty, her influence over Edward IV, and her family's rapid rise were all reinterpreted as evidence of magical rather than natural causes. These accusations tell us more about medieval attitudes toward female power than about Elizabeth's actual behavior. Elizabeth's retreat to Bermondsey Abbey in her final years, whether voluntary or forced, represented withdrawal from the political world that had brought her such mixed fortune. After decades at the center of power struggles, she spent her last years in religious quiet. This ending contrasts sharply with the dramatic public life she'd led as queen. It's almost as if she lived two different lives, one in the spotlight, one in shadow. The question of how Elizabeth viewed her own life and legacy is something we can only speculate about. Did she feel her life had been successful because her daughter became queen and her bloodline continued in the monarchy? Or did the loss of her sons overshadow everything else? Did she look back on her secret marriage to Edward IV with satisfaction or regret? We don't have her perspective in her own words. What's clear is that Elizabeth experienced extremes of fortune that few people encounter. She went from struggling widow to queen through a love marriage. She lived in royal luxury and in sanctuary poverty. She was politically powerful and politically helpless. She saw her family elevated and destroyed. She was celebrated as beautiful queen and condemned as witch. Her life contained almost every possible variation of fortune. The enduring mystery of the princes in the Tower ensures that Elizabeth's story remains relevant and discussed centuries after her death. Every generation of historians re-examines the evidence about what happened to Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. Some exonerate Richard III and look for alternative explanations. Others remain convinced Richard ordered the boys' deaths. The mystery is unlikely to ever be definitively solved. For Elizabeth, this mystery meant something much more personal than historical debate. These were her sons, children she'd carried and raised, boys she'd tried to protect by keeping one in sanctuary and then surrendered to Richard's custody. Whether they died quickly or slowly, from violence or illness, on Richard's orders or through some other cause, the result was the same. Elizabeth lost them and never knew their fate with certainty. The fact that Elizabeth made the agreement to support Henry Tudor and to have her daughter marry him, even while her sons were missing, raises questions about her state of mind and motivations. Had she accepted that her sons were dead? Was she seeking revenge against Richard III? Was she trying to secure futures for her surviving daughters since her sons were lost? Was it all of these things simultaneously? Some historians have suggested that Elizabeth must have known or believed her sons were dead by the time she made the alliance with Margaret Beaufort, because otherwise she wouldn't have agreed to see her daughter marry Henry Tudor. If one of her sons survived, he would have had a better claim to the throne than Henry. Elizabeth, supporting Henry's claim, implies she didn't expect her sons to return to claim their inheritance. But we should be careful about assuming too much about Elizabeth's knowledge or beliefs. She was in sanctuary, cut off from reliable information, probably receiving conflicting reports about what was happening in the outside world. She might have hoped her sons were alive while also planning for the possibility they weren't. She might have prioritized her daughter's futures while holding on to hope for her sons. Human psychology in extreme circumstances isn't always rational or consistent. The treatment of Elizabeth by Henry VII after his victory is itself interesting and somewhat puzzling to historians. Initially, she seemed to maintain reasonable status as the king's mother-in-law. Then she was suddenly sent to Bermondsey Abbey and removed from public life. This change suggests something happened to alter Henry's perception of her, or to make him decide she was politically problematic. But what exactly that was remains uncertain. One possibility that historians have considered is that Elizabeth learned something about the fate of her sons and reacted in ways that made Henry nervous. If she discovered that Richard III had indeed ordered their deaths, she might have wanted justice or revenge that would be politically inconvenient for Henry. If she heard rumors that they might have survived, she might have shown interest in investigating these rumors, which Henry would want to suppress to avoid challenges to his throne. Another possibility is that Elizabeth's very existence as Edward IV's widow and mother of the missing princes made her symbolically powerful in ways Henry couldn't control. She represented the Yorkist past and could become a focus for nostalgia or opposition to Tudor rule. Sending her to Bermondsey removed her from politics without the scandal of harsher treatment. It was a practical solution to the problem of what to do with a former queen who had no clear role in the new regime. A third theory is that Elizabeth violated some agreement or expectation Henry VII had about her behavior. Perhaps she was supposed to maintain low profile and instead tried to assert influence. Perhaps she criticized how Henry was treating her daughters or handling Yorkist sympathizers. Perhaps she simply annoyed Henry enough that he decided to remove her from court. Medieval sources don't give us enough detail to know. What's certain is that Elizabeth's final years at Bermondsey Abbey were far removed from the power and drama of her earlier life. She went from being a central figure in English politics to being largely forgotten by the public, living quietly in monastic setting. For someone who'd been at the heart of royal court for 2 decades, this must have been a dramatic change. Whether it was relief or disappointment probably depended on her state of mind and physical health. The modest nature of Elizabeth's funeral and burial has puzzled some historians, who wonder why a former queen wasn't given more elaborate rites. Some suggest it reflected her reduced status at the time of death. Others propose it might have been her own wishes, seeking simplicity after a life of complexity. Still others think Henry VII deliberately kept it modest to avoid drawing attention to the Yorkist past that Elizabeth represented. Elizabeth's tomb at Windsor Castle, next to Edward IV, is appropriate but relatively simple. It doesn't have the elaborate monument that some royal tombs feature. Elizabeth and Edward rest together, reunited in death as they'd been separated by death and politics in life. Their tomb is a reminder of the secret marriage that started it all, the love match that broke royal conventions and changed English history. The judgment of history on Elizabeth Woodville has varied over time. Medieval chroniclers were often negative, reflecting the bias against her as a commoner who'd become queen. Later historians sometimes portrayed her more sympathetically, as a woman trying to protect her family in dangerous circumstances. Modern popular culture has often romanticized her story, emphasizing the love story with Edward IV and the tragedy of the lost princes. Separating Elizabeth's actual character and motivations from these various interpretations is difficult. We have facts about what she did, but limited information about why or what she was thinking. She married Edward IV secretly. Was this calculated ambition, genuine love, or both? She fled to sanctuary twice. Was this strategic brilliance, maternal instinct, or simply the only option available? She allied with Margaret Beaufort. Was this pragmatic politics or desperate revenge? Probably all these interpretations have some truth. Elizabeth was likely a complex person with mixed motivations who adapted her strategies to circumstances. She wasn't simply a romantic heroine, or simply an ambitious climber, or simply a tragic mother. She was a medieval woman navigating an incredibly difficult and dangerous political landscape, making the choices that seemed best at each moment, sometimes succeeding and sometimes failing. The accusation that Elizabeth used witchcraft or sorcery to capture Edward IV's love tells us more about medieval anxieties about female power than about Elizabeth herself. When women achieved influence, particularly through sexuality or beauty, they were often accused of supernatural intervention. Men couldn't accept that women might be influential through natural charm, intelligence, or capability, so they invented magical explanations. Elizabeth's refusal to become a mistress was reinterpreted as magical ability to manipulate the king. These witchcraft accusations were politically useful for Elizabeth's enemies. They provided an explanation for her rise that discredited both her and her children. If she'd bewitched Edward IV, then their marriage might be invalid, and their children might not be legitimate heirs. These accusations served the interests of people who wanted to remove the Woodvilles from power, or who wanted to contest the succession of Elizabeth's children, but there's no credible evidence that Elizabeth practiced any kind of magic or sorcery. She seems to have been conventionally religious for her era, founding religious institutions and supporting the church. The witch accusations were propaganda and political attacks rather than truth, yet they've persisted in popular culture and historical memory, showing how difficult it is for powerful women to escape gendered criticism even centuries later. Elizabeth's relationship with her daughter Elizabeth of York is not extensively documented in historical sources, but it was clearly important. Elizabeth Woodville had negotiated her daughter's marriage to Henry VII as part of ending the Wars of the Roses. Elizabeth of York became a successful queen, who was apparently well-liked and who provided Henry VII with heirs, including the future Henry VIII. The mother must have taken some satisfaction in her daughter's success. As we reach the end of Elizabeth Woodville's story, what lessons can we draw from this remarkable medieval woman's life? First, beauty and personal charm can be powerful political tools, but they need to be combined with intelligence and strategy to be effective long-term. Elizabeth's beauty caught Edward IV's attention, but her intelligence and self-knowledge led her to refuse becoming his mistress and to hold out for marriage. This combination of assets allowed her to rise from commoner widow to Queen of England. Second, political fortune can change with shocking speed, and survival often requires adaptability and willingness to endure difficult circumstances. Elizabeth went from royal luxury to sanctuary poverty multiple times. She adapted to each change, doing what was necessary to protect herself and her children. This flexibility and resilience allowed her to survive when many others in similar circumstances didn't. Third, the protection of children can motivate extraordinary courage and risk-taking. Elizabeth went into sanctuary pregnant, gave birth in difficult circumstances, and later surrendered her son to Richard III's custody. Every decision she made about her children involved agonizing choices between bad options. Medieval motherhood, especially for royal mothers, meant navigating impossible decisions where children's lives were at stake. Fourth, political alliances often require cooperating with former enemies when interests align. Elizabeth and Margaret Beaufort had been on opposite sides of the Wars of the Roses, but they found common cause against Richard III. Their alliance, cemented by the marriage of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, ended decades of civil war. Pragmatic politics sometimes requires setting aside old enmities for greater goals. Fifth, women exercising power in patriarchal societies often face gendered attacks that men don't encounter. Elizabeth was accused of witchcraft and sorcery to explain her influence, attacks that reflected medieval anxieties about powerful women rather than any actual evidence of wrongdoing. These gendered criticisms persisted throughout her life and continue in historical memory, showing how difficult it is for powerful women to escape this pattern. Sixth, the mysteries of history often center on the most tragic events, and some questions may never be answered definitively. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower ensures that Elizabeth's story remains relevant centuries later. Every generation re-examines the evidence, hoping to solve the mystery. But some historical questions may never be answered, and we must live with uncertainty about what really happened. Seventh, personal losses can overshadow political successes. Elizabeth achieved remarkable things. She became queen, elevated her family, survived multiple crises, and saw her daughter become queen of a new dynasty. But the loss of her sons probably overshadowed all these achievements. Historical success and personal happiness aren't the same thing, and Elizabeth's story shows how political triumph can coexist with personal tragedy. Eighth, genealogical legacy can extend influence across centuries. Elizabeth's bloodline continues in British royalty to this day through her daughter, Elizabeth of York. Every monarch since Henry VII has been descended from the commoner widow who secretly married Edward IV. This genealogical legacy means Elizabeth's influence on English history extended far beyond her own lifetime and continues in the present. Ninth, the beginning of a story doesn't determine its ending. Elizabeth started as a widow with confiscated property, struggling to support her children. She could never have predicted becoming queen, or that her descendants would rule England. Life's unpredictability means that current circumstances, no matter how difficult, don't foreclose future possibilities. Elizabeth's unlikely rise shows that dramatic change is possible. Finally, the truth about historical figures is often more complex than either hagiographic or critical accounts suggest. Elizabeth was neither perfect heroine nor scheming villain, but rather a medieval woman making difficult choices in dangerous circumstances. Understanding her requires seeing both her achievements and her failures, both her courage and her limitations, both her successes and her losses. Historical figures are human, which means they're complicated. Thank you for joining me tonight on Histocrat at Night as we've explored the extraordinary life of Elizabeth Woodville, the White Queen. From widow waiting under an oak tree to Queen of England, from royal luxury to sanctuary poverty, from political power to monastic retirement, her journey was filled with dramatic reversals that seem almost impossible. She loved a king, married him secretly, became queen, survived wars and betrayals, lost her sons to history's most enduring mystery, and ultimately became the grandmother of a new royal dynasty. Her story reminds us that beauty combined with intelligence can be powerful, that survival often requires extraordinary adaptability, that protecting children motivates tremendous courage, that former enemies can become allies when circumstances change, and that women exercising power face gendered attacks that persist for centuries. Elizabeth's life shows both the possibilities and the perils of female power in medieval society. As you drift off to sleep tonight, think about the young widow who refused to become a king's mistress and insisted on marriage, who gave birth in sanctuary while her husband was in exile, who lost her sons to circumstances that remain mysterious 500 years later, who allied with a former enemy to end a civil war, who saw her daughter become queen and unite two warring dynasties, and whose blood flows through British royalty to this day. Think about the courage required to survive such a life, the adaptability needed to navigate such dramatic changes in fortune, and the resilience necessary to keep going despite devastating losses. The White Queen reminds us that historical figures are rarely simple heroes or villains, but complex people facing impossible choices in difficult circumstances. Elizabeth made decisions that seemed right at the time, sometimes succeeded, sometimes failed, and ultimately created a legacy that extended far beyond her own lifetime. Her secret marriage broke royal conventions and changed English history. Her beauty captured a king's heart. Her determination protected her family through years of danger. Her losses haunt history. Her legacy lives on. Sleep well, knowing that Elizabeth Woodville's story teaches us about love and loss, power and vulnerability, survival and tragedy, all intertwined in one remarkable medieval woman's life. Until next time, remember that history's most compelling stories often center on people who started with little and achieved much, who faced terrible circumstances and somehow endured, and whose personal tragedies become part of larger historical narratives that shape how we understand the past. Elizabeth Woodville, the commoner who became Queen of England, the mother who lost her sons to mystery, the woman whose descendants would rule for centuries, she lived one of history's most dramatic lives. And her story reminds us that real life can be more extraordinary than any fiction.